Welcome to Grief with Portia, the podcast that uncovers the hidden treasures within grief. I'm your host, Portia the producer, and I'm inviting you to join me on a transformative journey where we will exchange laughter, of course the best medicine of them all, reflect on cherished memories, remember that time that the little boy grabbed my hand instead of his mother's at the amusement park? Yikes. And of course discover gratitude while navigating one of life's hardest challenges, loss. So get ready to groove with me, Portia the producer. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Grief with Portia. I'm your host, Portia Booker. Before we begin this conversation today, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep up with the latest and greatest of all with Grief with Portia. So today I have the honor of having Miss Helen Fernald on the show. She is a grief recovery mentor, photographer, and also the author of Love, Helen, Letters to My Mother. So welcome, Helen, to Grief with Portia. How are you today?
First of all, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here, very grateful to be with you and your audience, and I am great. So thank you for asking.
Helen, when I saw that your book was titled Love, Helen, Letters to My Mother, and the fact that you also had a mother transition, I'm like, yes, we have to have this conversation.
Yes.
Because mothers are so precious, right? We don't realize the heartbreak, the deep heartbreak that you have when your mother transitions. And so, Helen, I'm curious for you. I always love to start off my conversations with gratitude. What are you grateful for today?
First of all, I am just grateful to be here. I am very passionate, like you, about sharing the message that grief is very real. So I'm extraordinarily grateful to be able to talk with you and your audience about this theme, which in the end is a universal theme. At some point in our adult lives, and also sometimes as children, all of us will face grief over something or someone. So it is an extraordinarily important topic, but I think it sort of got lost in the shuffle in this culture. So I think it's our turn to bring it back up so that people understand that it's a real thing and understand that there are many ways to deal with it. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. Thank you.
You know, Helen, I'm glad you brought up the many ways to work with our grief. I'm a firm believer that we can learn to integrate it into our everyday. And Helen, one of the things that I love about you is you took the opportunity to write, to really write these letters and integrate your grief into a creative funnel, such as your book. And I'm curious, Helen, for you, what was that journey like for you to say, you know, I'm going to use writing as my form of expressing the heartbreak, expressing the numbness, that empty void? What was that journey like for you to open yourself up to start to write when you have so many emotions fighting for the spotlight?
That's such a great question. Thank you. I think for me, it was a very long journey. My mother died when I was only 40. I honestly thought she would live forever. I'd already lost my great uncle, who was like my grandfather. I'd already lost my father. So then, but I just thought my mother would be there forever. And then suddenly I got the news that she was gone. And that was the end of that. But I grew up in a family, I think as many of us in this country, I grew up in the family where we were taught to just stuff our emotions inside and just carry on with life. And I had actually watched my mother do that. My mother and father were very close. They were deeply in love. But when my father died, that's what my mother did. She just smiled and pushed herself onward. And so I did that actually. That year prior to my mother's death and 3 months after my mother's death, I actually had 2 miscarriages. So it was a year that was filled with horrible grief. And yet I didn't know what to do with anything. And then 9 months after that, after the second miscarriage, our son was born. So then I just got very busy taking care of my family and my newborn and all those things. And then, as so often happens in these stories, 5 years later, I completely fell apart. But the gift of that was that was like an opening for me to begin a new part in my life. And I come from a family of letter writers. I'm not sure how many people can still say that in this world, but I feel like, I basically left home at 18 when I went off to college. And from the time I was 18 until I was 68, when my brother died, So for 50 years, I actually wrote weekly letters to my family. At first it was my mother and father and brother, and then it was my mother and brother, and then it was my brother. And so that was how we corresponded. But I hadn't really thought about that. And one day I have a back room, a family room where I go in the morning to meditate and to pray. And I remember going back there 16 years after my mother had died. And I had done a lot of grief work, but I still just felt so overwhelmed. And I remember going back there and I literally threw up my hands in the air and said, I don't know what to do now. And I immediately heard the answer in my head, write letters to your mother. And I thought, oh, I can do that. I've spent my life doing that. So I never did it in a fancy way. I honestly just grabbed the notebook that was that was closest. And for 8 years, I just allowed every part of my grief to just come out. It would just pour out. And it was the first time in my life because I could do it in my own private space. Nobody was watching. Nobody had to ever read those letters, and I could just cry and release and release. And then I would get new memories and new memories. And it was just this extraordinary experience during these 8 years. Also, honestly, I'm not a poet under normal circumstances, but during those 8 years, I would just get these beautiful prayers and these beautiful, beautiful poems. And one of the poems that I got was Grief, the Greatest Mentor. And I thought, by the end of my 8 years, that is so true, because befriending, for me, that is what is befriending my grief. I actually took my grief, and instead of stuffing it down, I let it just pour out. And I listened to my grief, and I listened to whatever I needed to know and to do. And it was just this extraordinary experience. And by the end of those 8 years, I felt like I was in a completely different place in my life. I think the greatest gift for me was that after writing all of those letters and really allowing my inner feelings to be exposed, I realized I felt such compassion to myself, such compassion to my mother. I think my mother was always very busy when I was young. And, as a child, sometimes we resent that. Wow, by the time I finished writing letters for 8 years, I would think to myself, I have no idea how my mother did all the things she did. She was amazing. So I had this completely different relationship with my mother. And and then I think once you have compassion for yourself and you have compassion for another person, you have compassion for the world because you understand that every single person is going through something. And I just think it changes our entire outlook. So I feel it was really this extraordinary journey that I never had anticipated in my entire life. I have felt very guided by this whole journey, and I just feel such deep gratitude and such gratitude because really writing letters is not complicated. You don't need fancy things. You don't need, fancy stationery, not when you're doing this work. And the other piece that I loved about doing this, obviously, I chose to publish my letters because I felt that they could be of great help to people. But what I always tell people is no one ever needs to see your letters. And that's why we can really be honest with ourselves. Because grief always involves anger. Grief always involves so many expressions that we're so afraid because somebody's going to judge us, or we're going to be bad people if we let anybody see those. But when we write them, we can just throw that notebook away. We can burn it. Nobody ever has to see any of that. So it really is a liberation of our soul, I think, when we choose to write letters.
Helen, you brought up something that grief was your greatest mentor.
Yes.
And when you look at the word grief, the way that it's spelled, it
Yes.
has IE in the middle. And IE stands for what? Example,
Yes.
learning,
Oh
right?
my gosh, I love that. I never looked at it that way. I love
Yeah.
that. Thank you so much. I love that.
And I'm
Yes.
glad that you reiterated that because I think a lot of times as a society, we think grief is the enemy. We think pain is
Yes.
the enemy
Yes.
when we go through grief, not just when we experience a transition of a loved one,
Right.
right? We grieve when that job that we thought we were going to
Yes.
level up
Yes.
in
Yes.
gets cut. I mean, look at the
Right.
way of the world now with
Yes.
social media changing how
Yes.
we interact, how we
Yes.
apply for jobs, how we do everything. And Helen, another thing
Exactly.
you brought up was about your faith. And I'm always curious about this. What did it take for you to walk towards your faith and not walk away, considering your mom had transitioned and you also had two miscarriages kind of in the mix of that? So I'm curious, what did it take for you to
Thank
hold
you.
on to your faith?
Thank you. I feel like I was very fortunate because I grew up in a family where there was a lot of faith. And it's not something that honestly we talked about a lot, but I feel like my parents demonstrated that in their own lives. And, they, like every other person, had great challenges in their lives. And they had to have faith in order to get through that. If I ever think about my parents, I think one of the most challenging times in their lives was that they were married, and my father had already enlisted in the army. He didn't have to because he was actually above the age limit, but he felt it was his responsibility, so he enlisted. And then he had gotten, a special weekend so they could get married, and that weekend got completely cut off. So they had the service, and then they spent their honeymoon night, which back in those days really was a honeymoon night, on the train all the way from Cleveland, Ohio to the University of New Hampshire. And then they were separated for 3 years. And what did they do? They wrote letters to each other, and they had to have that faith that carried them through in every moment until my father got back home. So I think that those were powerful examples. My father was a great lover of music. And, this was way back in the day when we had the records and the vinyl records. And one of his favorite things to listen to were hymns. So I grew up all the time listening to these beautiful hymns, which have this very high vibration. Just, they're talking about joy and love and hope and faith. And so I think that all of those things just were so instilled in me as a young child. And then I lived in Spain for 2 years, and Spain is just so filled with faith. People talk about their faith all the time, much more so than I ever talked about faith with my own family growing up. And so I feel that that was also an integral part. So I think I'm very lucky to have had that experience because I think it was just natural for me. I think my mother was a very optimistic person, and that's also faith. And so no matter what, she would always find the blessing in it, always. And she taught me to do that, which was just an extraordinary, extraordinary gift also. So I'm very grateful for all that.
And Helen, it's beautiful that you're able to honor that piece of your mom, because I think
Mhm.
so many
Mm,
people, when they lose their
yes.
mother, I can say for me, there's a level of addiction that you
Yes.
have to that grief of
Yes.
their transition,
Mhm.
because it's hard for you to recognize and
Yes.
remember all of the
Yes.
positive qualities that you took from
Yes.
them, their
Yes.
optimism, their intellect,
Yes.
their
Yes.
smile. My mom
Yes.
always had a saying, make the best of it, darling. That was one of my
Yes.
mom's favorite sayings.
Your mom and my mom were a lot alike, I think. Yes.
And so you did it. And I'm curious too, Helen, you brought up about the ability to cry. And I think in our society, there's this notion that
Yes.
weakness,
Yes.
vulnerability is
Yes.
frowned upon
Yes.
unless you
Yes.
have certain accolades or stature in the world.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm curious, Helen, what did it take for you to give yourself that permission to be vulnerable and cry? And how can we encourage others
Mhm.
who are on their grief journey, whether they've had the
Mhm.
physical transition of someone or they're going through other
Right.
transitions in their life, to give themselves that permission and grace?
I think that's such a beautiful question. Because I agree. As I said, I was certainly never taught to cry. I was just taught to smile through life. So I think for me, though, it was once I started writing those letters, I couldn't help it. It just literally poured out of me. It was as though I had no choice. It was as if I just opened this gate and said, "Okay, grief, do what you need to do." And whoosh, it just came out. But I think what you're asking is such an important question, because I think if we look back, let's say 100 years ago, I remember, as a child, the Westerns were really popular, and I didn't particularly like Westerns, but my brother loved Westerns, of course. So I remember, walking through a room one time and seeing this whole scene where it was some Western town and somebody had died. So they just put the body on the table and everybody came in and they were all surrounded and they were all crying. And I I just at the time I thought, oh, that's terrible. But then when I started crying, I thought, oh, we have missed this. We have lost out on this. This is really the natural reaction. This is what we do when we lose. This is how we are actually programmed as human beings. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful thing. I think it's what you're saying. When you see somebody who has the accolades, somebody important who begins to cry, we're like, yes, yes. But do we let ourselves do that? Not always. But I remember seeing, I have a master's in Spanish, and so I love to watch TV in Spanish. And I remember watching some dance show, and they had these, very well-known actors and actresses who were partnered with, with good dancers. And then they would interview them, and there was one young Mexican guy who was, I don't know, maybe in his 30s, very, very well known as a singer. And I remember he started to talk about his grandmother and how she had passed and what she meant to him, and he started to cry, and it was so moving. It was so moving to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all be so honest? Because that's how we really feel. We want to cry. And I think when we do cry and allow other people to see that, I think we give permission to other people also, because they think to themselves, okay, well, she could do it, so I guess I'm not just a baby to do it. I guess I can actually do that too. We kind of have this old expression. I knew, my brother used to say it to me, oh, don't be a crybaby, and and I'm grateful to say I have not heard that lately, but I don't have young children anymore either. So and I mean, I certainly never said it to my children. I actually always encourage them to cry because I think it's really important. It's just another human emotion. But I think you're right. I think we need to begin to change that back to when it was safe to cry and when it was okay, because we are expressing deep emotions and it's such a normal reaction.
100%. And I think to your point, Helen, I know when my mom transitioned, I could not cry for a while.
No,
I
exactly.
mean,
Yeah.
there was a lot of, and you touched on anger, right?
Yes.
And as
Yes.
women,
Yes.
anger is frowned upon. That's almost saying
Yes.
a bad word in
Yes,
church if you're
exactly.
angry as a woman.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
that was my primary seat of occupancy when my
Right.
mom transitioned, that anger
Right.
of, God, I'm not happy with you.
Yes.
Ma, I'm angry at
Yes.
you because you left
Yes.
me and
Yes. Yes.
I'm here.
Yes.
I don't know what
Yes.
to do. And
Exactly. Yes, I felt exactly the same way. And you reminded me of one other point that I think is very important. I think that often we don't cry because there's a voice in our head that says, if you start crying, you will never stop. And we know that we can't go through life crying. We know that. We just don't realize that if we let ourselves cry from time to time, we can go on with our lives. But I think you make such great points. I felt the same about my mother. I was like, why did you leave me so soon? I need you. What were you thinking? And yet it's that horrible feeling. There is actually a letter in my very toward the end when I finally had the courage to write about that anger. I said, Mom, I can't believe that I have to write this to you because I feel like such a terrible person. But the truth of the matter is that when you died, I was really angry. I needed you desperately. You left way too soon. And I think that's, all of this is such a natural. I mean, when in Kubler-Ross, I believe when she talked about grief, anger was very much a step in that. But I also think for me at least, and I've heard this from other women also, that, if we start to cry, we're just never going to stop. So we just have to stuff it inside and be tough. And I think that explains a lot of why we can't We can't cry in those moments. We're just trying to hang on to whatever strength is within us so we don't look so completely vulnerable, because we're taught not to be vulnerable. So I think it's just a very complex situation, and I hope that our conversation, and I know other conversations that you will have with other people on similar themes, will begin to allow people to understand the importance of being authentic in our emotions, not just showing one side, but truly being authentic.
And I'm glad you reiterated that, Helen, because you're right. I think vulnerability is said, but it's
Yes.
not accepted, right? It
Oh,
it kind of
yes.
reminds me of
Yes.
the
Yes.
notion of we
Yes.
are inclusive of all
Yes.
walks of life. However, if someone comes in and they have purple hair,
Yes.
everybody's giving them the side eye. So,
Exactly. Yes.
where's the real alignment to the saying
Yes.
vulnerability is welcomed here? And this is
Yes.
why I hold space for people, Helen, when I host my grief groups, because that's what a
Yes.
lot of people need is they
Yes.
just need someone to listen, to talk about their
Yes.
person and not try to
Yes.
fix them
No.
or hide the
No.
messiness of grief. And
Yes.
that's for a whole
Yes.
nother day. Helen, first of all, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to be wrapping up here soon, but I know that there's somebody out there in our audience who would want to connect with you, get a copy of your book. Can you please share with them how they can connect with you and where they can get your book?
Thank you so much. Yes. So everything is on my website, which is simply helenfernald.com. They can actually buy the book through my website, but they can also buy it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It can be ordered through Barnes and Noble also. And it does come in both the hardcover, the soft cover, and the audiobook. So people have and the ebook also. So people do have a selection on that. And yes, and I will be teaching classes beginning in later in the fall. But all of that information will also be on my website. So thank you for asking.
Excellent. So, those of you who want to get a copy of Helen's book, Love Helen, Letters to My Mother, you can on Helen's website and also on any of the major book
Yes.
distribution platforms, whether it's Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever you prefer to go, right?
Yes, exactly.
Helen, before we wrap up, I mean, you have shared so many amazing things with us today. Number one, about honoring our space of occupancy, no matter where we're at in our grief journey, right? Utilizing writing as a
Yes.
tool to really help us to heal
Mm.
and to really integrate our
Mm.
grief into our everyday, and also reminding us that it's okay to be angry, right?
Yes.
We're
Yes.
allowed. And I'll
Yes.
say number 4, that our faith is what keeps us afloat during
Yes.
these seasons of
Yes.
grief.
Yes.
And for our listening audience, Heather, Helen, for our listening audience, what piece of wisdom can you leave with them today, no matter where they're at in their grief journey, in order for them to give themselves grace and permission to integrate and also to just be?
I think that my greatest advice would be to simply befriend our own grief, to really listen, to stop and listen, and to cry or to write or to speak with a therapist, whatever it is that allows us to continue to move forward, to always remember that grief is real and that it's looking for help.
And remember, as you said in the beginning, grief is your greatest mentor.
Yes,
And I've
yes.
said to all of you before that grief is the birthplace of transformation. It may
I
not
love
appear
that.
as though it is in the beginning,
No.
but if you open yourself up, you need to be broken open in order
Yes.
to be refilled.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to look at it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And
No,
again,
thank you.
thank you so much for this opportunity. I loved talking to you. I felt like we had so much in common and it was truly a gift. So thank you so much.
No, Helen, thank you. The pleasure is all mine. I was excited when I saw, your book and the fact that you lost your mom too, because there's so many of us who are walking around out here who have
Yes.
experienced that loss of our mom and we
Yes.
don't know what to do. And so
Yes.
we need that example, right? That teacher
Yes.
to
Yes.
help us. So
Yes.
everybody. That was Miss Helen Fernald that you heard from. That it concludes another episode of Grew with Portia. Thank you all so much. And until next time, peace and hair grease, everybody.